Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we will summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news. And you can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for a bunch more articles that we will not cover. I am one of your hosts, Andrei Kurenkov. I finished my PhD at Stanford last year, and I now work at a generative AI startup. And this week, we do not have our usual co-host, Jeremy. He is on vacation, but we do have a wonderful guest co-host.
Hey, this is John Crone. I think this is my third time guest hosting on the show.
I think so, yeah.
But the previous two times I was co-hosting with Jeremy. So it's the first time that you get Andre and me, and I'm excited for this one. As regular listeners will know, or people who heard me in those previous episodes, I am a diehard listener to this podcast. And so it's such a treat to be able to come on here. In addition to spending as much time as I can every week listening to this podcast, I also host the Super Data Science podcast, which is, as far as we can tell, the world's most listened to data science podcast. And that's more of an interview show than a news show, if people are interested in that kind of stuff. I'm also co-founder and chief data scientist at a machine learning company called Nebula. So that's me. And Andre, should we talk about the beers now? This reminds me of the podcast that I used to love and that inspired me to get into podcasting about data science was a show called Partially Derivative.
Mm-hmm.
And on that show, Partially Derivative, they always were drinking beer on air. And so they would open up every episode talking about what beer they're drinking. And so in today's episode, that's the sound of me opening my beer, but we have a bit of a twist here. This is kind of like, I don't think I even qualify as a millennial, but it's like a millennial twist on having a beer on air because we're drinking Athletic Brewing Company beers, both of us, and these are basically non-alcoholic. They have 0.5% of alcohol per beer.
Yeah, it just so happened that I had one open at my desk, and John saw it and also got one out. It seems we are both fans. I wish we could be sponsored and this would be an ad, but it's not. It's just some fun little detail for the listeners. Before we get going with AI, we are enjoying some nice non-alcoholic beer to keep us hydrated as we talk for an hour and a half about all the latest AI news.
If I can drag this on for like one more second, Andre, what flavor? What's the particular kind of Athletic Brewing that you're enjoying today?
I got the Run Wild IPA, my favorite variant. And I'm not sure if you could call this healthy, but it's certainly better than soda or whatever else you want. And I really like it, so.
Yeah, I think it's delicious. I have this Emerald Cliffs, which is a limited edition one. If you can still get this online, I highly recommend it. It's supposed to be, I guess, like a Guinness, and it's absolutely delicious. I love it.
And just one more thing before we get into the content of the show and all the news. As usual, I do want to call out and thank a couple of reviewers. We got a couple new ones over the last few weeks on Apple Podcasts. There's El Shum that said, great podcast and enjoys it a lot. There's Lone Wolf R also saying great podcast and has some useful bits of feedback with, I think Jeremy sometimes does repeat some details I say just because we say so much. So thank you for feedback. We'll try to incorporate it as we go forward, Lone Wolf R. And I guess John, FYI,
I'll try not to
repeat.
That's such an interesting one because if you paraphrase the important points, it can end up really making it easier for listeners to apprehend that particularly important information. So it's a tricky balance to strike, I think, as a podcast host.
Mm-hmm.
But good feedback for sure.
Yeah. Alrighty, well, let's dive into the news, starting as usual with the tools and apps section. And the first story is about AI-generated music yet again, the kind of one of the highlight trends of the year, it seems. And this time it is coming from ElevenLabs. ElevenLabs, if you've been following it for a while, you probably know, is a leading source of AI generated voice. You can give it text and get really good high quality voice outputs. And now they have given us a sneak peek of their work on AI generated music via some posts on Twitter or X. So not quite out yet, not clear when it will be out, but they did post a few examples, and the examples, I listened to them, really clean, really convincing results there. We now have two big players. We recently just covered a new entry with Udio. There's also Suno, now ElevenLabs, seemingly also entering into the space, or soon to be entering into the space of music generation with yet another model that is, like, when I listen to it, it's hard to tell it's AI generated. So yeah, we are very much in the realm of generating full songs that are indistinguishable almost from AI music or human music with AI.
Udio was the vendor that you guys used a few weeks ago to change up your theme song, right?
That's true, yeah.
I was surprised that you guys haven't continued to have different theme songs every week. I guess it would kind of take away from the branding of it.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a soft spot for our current theme. I kind of just like the sound of it, and it could be fun. Maybe the outro music I'll switch out every time.
I do like your intro music. It feels like I'm being lulled into calm by an AI system that is going to take over the world and eat my brain. It's like you're just being just relax, don't worry. AI is coming. It's going to destroy everything. Just relax. I love it.
Yes, it's a good kind of preparer for the onslaught of AI news that we are facing every week.
Yeah, and so this is interesting, this ElevenLabs story. I've just been digressing basically so far since I've been on. But they're a big player in this generation space. They closed a $80 million Series B 3 months ago at a unicorn valuation. And at the Super Data Science podcast, we've actually experimented with using ElevenLabs to clone my own voice, because we recently started doing these In Case You Missed It episodes that happen once a month. And they recap the most interesting parts of conversation from the preceding month. And the production team was like, let's make your life easier so that at least one episode of the month, you don't have to be involved. But in the end, it's one of those interesting things where you're like, AI could do it, and it absolutely sounded like me. But because to make the transitions between those conversations really good anyway, I've got to script it, and then I might as well just record it anyway. It takes like an extra minute. So it's one of these interesting things. You guys were talking last week about how in generative AI, the chat application is kind of well worn through, but there's lots of other areas. It was GitHub, I think, specifically last week you were talking about that with, where there's new ways that you can be using generative AI. But it's interesting how it can get you so close, but just be a little bit off of really, at least today, saving you time in reality. And I guess that's just going to get better and better and better as we have more and more tools and we become better at syncing them all together, linking them all together, and kind of having a web of AI systems that act as agents, act as generators, and really do make our lives easier and save us a lot of time.
Yeah, I think it's very much context dependent. So like we're not a place where AI can replace everyone at everything, right? But as we'll be talking about later, for ElevenLabs and voice generation, there's now a prominent example of Audible where you do have audiobooks. Many of them will get to this near end of a show being generated with AI now. And similarly, I would imagine with music, it won't replace popular artists, but for TV shows, for movies, for things where you might want to quickly generate a song, especially for indie or less financially backed projects,
like podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, exciting news from ElevenLabs, and you can go to the link in the description as always to actually listen to the song. It's pretty impressive. Next story. This one actually happened last week, but we do want to make sure to touch on it since we didn't last week. And it is that mysterious GPT-2 chatbot AI model appear suddenly and confused experts. So this was on the LLMs chatbot arena, which we mentioned quite a lot. It's where people can basically vote on which are the best chatbots and give a score. And it appeared and got pretty good scores. And everyone was wondering, is this from OpenAI? Is this some kind of a new model they're working on? There was no details at all as to what it's from. But it did have pretty impressive reasoning abilities and did pretty well, although also had some weaknesses compared to GPT-4. And all of this is happening as we are waiting. OpenAI has announced that next Monday, so next week, just a couple of days from when we are recording, they have some sort of announcement coming on Monday morning. So people have been speculating that it's search, and OpenAI said, no, it's not search, and it's not GPT-5. Is this GPT-2 thing related? Maybe it's some sort of extra small model that's really good. Nobody knows. But it's interesting that this happened. And it's a fun little story to be aware of.
You've had a lot of shows recently on not overtraining, but following the chinchilla scaling laws that you guys talk about on the show a fair bit. There has been a trend recently towards taking small models and training them a ton with a huge amount of data beyond what would be kind of the economically optimal choice according to the chinchilla scaling laws, but you do nevertheless get really great results. And so it would be interesting to see if this is in that space. It's kind of, I don't know, this is a shameless plug, and you can pull this out, Andre, if you want to when you're editing. But the team that created LMSys, we had the head of that team, Professor Joey Gonzalez, on my show Super Data Science in episode number 707, and he talks about LMSys a lot, which was new at that time. And yeah, it's a really cool way to be comparing models in a way that is crowdsourced and leveraging real human feedback. It's definitely the biggest player for doing that. I think the most well thought through website for comparing chatbots in that manner.
Yeah, and these days, as we see more and more announcements of new models, we always mention that with benchmark results, it's always a bit iffy, right? You don't really know if a model was potentially trained on some data. You want to believe that people avoid those sorts of hacks to get the best numbers, but in some cases there have been some hacks or some at least weird ways of reporting numbers. So LMSys and things like it are pretty much the best way to know model quality, or at least one of the better ways. And again, later on in the show, we'll have another interesting bit of news with open source as to this topic.
Yeah, it's more expensive, but definitely higher quality and more reliable.
And on to the lightning round with some faster stories. First up, SoundHound AI and Perplexity partnered to bring online LLMs to next-gen voice assistants across cars and IoT devices. So SoundHound AI provides these sorts of voice assistants and have announced this partnership with Perplexity, Perplexity being an AI-driven search engine that has exploded over the past year. So that's about all the details we need to provide. Basically, you'll be able to query Perplexity and answer complex questions. Interesting to see Perplexity starting to do these sorts of partnerships and expanding beyond just their own platform, providing AI services to other platforms. Have you used Perplexity at all, John?
I actually have not. I've seen demonstrations of it, and it seems like a cool tool. I am kind of embarrassed that I haven't. As I'm sitting here, I'm like, man, I don't have a lot to say on this story, and I really should have used Perplexity by now.
Okay, well, now you have some homework for your next interviews. Might want to do some research with it, because I played around with it a little bit. I'm the same in that I haven't used it actively. Some people say they use it every day, like the NVIDIA CEO. I will say I don't use it actively, but I have played around with it, and it's cool. It's a cool tool.
I think, like, as we've spoken about this for 30 seconds more, my mind has kind of shaken off some cobwebs and reminded me that I think when I first heard about it, maybe a year ago, I did do some searches and I was like, wow, it's really nice UI, but it didn't scratch any actual informational need for me beyond what I could already retrieve very conveniently with either a Google search or a generative AI search with one of the tools that I was already using.
Next story, Stability AI sows Gen AI Discord with Stable Artisan. Kind of weird naming there from VentureBeat, but what it means is that you will now be able to use Stability AI image generation from Discord via Discord bot, similar to what Midjourney has been providing for a long time. And this will be a paid service. There's going to be a free trial, and then you do need to buy credits, very much the same as with Midjourney. That's pretty much the story. And I guess for people who love the Discord way of generating images, another tool you can use now.
Yeah, I don't know why anyone would deliberately want that. The weirdest thing for me about that is seeing other people in the images that they're generating or the content that they're generating alongside yours. It's a weird experience.
Yeah, it's good for communities, but as a individual making content, maybe less so, but still fun to see these new developments.
It's the exact opposite of Perplexity in terms of user experience. It's like Perplexity has such a beautiful UI and they're so thoughtful about user experience. And with doing everything in Discord, it's the exact inverse. But I guess that's the deliberate play there. It's let's get as quickly as possible the models out to people and not focus on UX. The interesting thing I think about focusing on UI like Perplexity does is that it gives you the capacity over time to be improving. If I went back to Perplexity today, I might say, wow, you guys have really done a lot more here and it is so much more valuable to me. Whereas, with the kind of Discord experience, that's not going to change.
Mm-hmm. Next up, Apple will revamp Siri to catch up on its chatbot competitors, and this is paired with a second story that Apple is nearing a deal with OpenAI to put ChatGPT on iPhones. So they are apparently finalizing terms for a deal to have ChatGPT features in Apple's iOS 18, and alongside that, there's been a major reorganization within Apple with a major focus on generative AI and seemingly this idea of upgrading Siri with generative AI capabilities. We've mentioned it before. It seems like a no-brainer, and I'm sure they'll get it going pretty seriously. And there's some announcements, presumably coming in the next few months regarding this.
Huge story, and it highlights the interesting dependencies between some of the biggest players in big tech. The other one that comes to mind for me immediately is the way that Google pays crazy amounts of money to Apple to have Google search be the default search on the iPhone. And this similarly seems to me this kind of situation where surely Apple would prefer not to be dependent upon Microsoft or ChatGPT for this technology. But it's expensive and there's very few talent on the planet that can get you to the frontier like just a handful of labs around the world are on generative AI. And so it makes a lot of sense pragmatically. I'm sure, however, with things like scrapping the Apple Car, which I was super excited about. I'd love to even just see what that was going to look like. But things like that project being scrapped so that resources can be diverted to generative AI, I wouldn't be surprised if we're not too far away, a year or two maybe, from Apple being able to do these kinds of generative AI projects on their own. And I would bet that they will have a huge focus on security and reliability, probably more so than being right at the cutting edge of capability. I imagine Apple will be a little bit more conservative in trying to make sure that they have the most secure, the most reliable outputs.
And just one more story for the section. Alibaba rolls out the latest version of its large language model to meet AI demand. So this is from Alibaba Cloud, and they have released the latest version of their model, Qwen 2.5. Some benchmarks say that it's comparable with GPT-4 in some capabilities like language and creation. And Alibaba does say that there's been over 90,000 deployments by various companies. So as always, be mindful that there's a whole ecosystem over in China of people competing and trying to create ChatGPT-esque models. And on to applications and business. And the first story is OpenAI and Stack Overflow partner to bring more technical knowledge into ChatGPT. Just last week, we talked about how OpenAI has been making a lot of deals with news publications like the Financial Times. And now there's been this announcement of OpenAI and Stack Overflow making a deal. Stack Overflow has been kind of a leading website for conversations regarding programming and just technical details. A lot of people go over to ask questions of like, how do I do this? I have this bug, et cetera, et cetera. And as a CS student from like a decade ago, this used to be a site you went to all the time. Right? They have a lot of data, and I'm pretty sure ChatGPT and all these other models have already been trained on that data, kind of. Anyway, so there's now the deal for OpenAI to have access to the Stack Overflow API and be able to use feedback from that community to enhance their models. And Stack Overflow will be attributed within ChatGPT, interestingly, similar to how ChatGPT will be attributing to things like the Financial Times. So yeah, another play by them, another potentially way to be able to overcome the limitation of having a knowledge cutoff in these models, right? That's one of the key limits of ChatGPT is it will always be trained up to a point in history of like April 2024 or whatever. So I think these sorts of plays speak to that, where with the integrations of news sources and these kind of forums regarding different question and answer topics, these tools can still be useful for things that come out after the training data.
Yeah, I think I'm probably a bit older than you, Andre. And it's interesting that when I began programming, the only way that I could get information on how to improve the code I was doing, or even just learn things about code, was from a book.
Yeah, that's from a while ago. Yeah.
So this is in an era where we were just starting to get dial-up internet at home, and we definitely did not have internet at school. So we would have PC labs, and you would go in and they would have the class textbook, and you'd learn C++ or Java or whatever. And you were just limited to your teacher's knowledge, your classmates' knowledge, and whatever was in the textbook. So definitely a different era there. But then the internet allowed us, of course, to be able to do Google searches and find information, originally more so in the documentation, kind of the official documentation for a given programming language. But then Stack Overflow became invaluable. It became the default, where I would get some stack trace, grab the error at the end of that trace, paste it into Google, it takes me to the Stack Overflow, and then I can just copy whatever the solution is without even having to think about it. And to underline the importance of Stack Overflow, it's interesting how Gemini from Google Cloud also inked a deal with Stack Overflow in February. And you can see why. If you want to be getting great coding suggestions, Stack Overflow is gotta be the best place on the internet by far. That is 90% of the time or more where that stack trace copy paste into Google takes me. And now it is really interesting. That is an example of something we were talking earlier in the episode about tasks like my voice being simulated for an episode of mine once a month, where that didn't quite meet the mark. Generative AI, for me now, Claude 3 Opus is where I go every single time when I have an error in my code, because it is so brilliant, in the same way that if you're familiar with doing that in GPT-4, or I haven't used GitHub Copilot myself, but I'm sure it's the same kind of situation where you get great feedback right away. And the thing that is different about doing that with a web search is that it is contextualized exactly to your code. So it can just rewrite your code for you. You don't have to change any variable names or anything.
It's true. I think for non-programmers listening, I'm sure some of you, it is very much the case. I think like there have been stats that Stack Overflow usage or visits have dropped by like 40%, just because ChatGPT and tools like it have pretty much surpassed the usefulness of things. So now going into the future, Stack Overflow will be mainly useful for things that don't exist yet, for dealing with new tools and stuff like that. And just one more note on the story before moving on. I think it is worth highlighting that an additional story that came out after this was that Stack Overflow has actually been banning users who have, in a sense, rebelled over this partnership. Some users have started trying to delete their answers to prevent them from being used to train ChatGPT. And Stack Overflow has tried to prevent that by banning users. So as we've seen often with these sorts of deals, to some extent with Reddit, not everyone is happy to have their work, their contributions be used to train AI models.
It's an interesting problem where I suspect the terms and conditions of using the site give them the right to do that, but nobody reads those. And then when things change. On the other hand, it's interesting to think we have this, people talk about us running into, what's it called? Model collapse. Mm-hmm. Where if we start losing high quality real sources of data like Stack Overflow, if people stop contributing to Stack Overflow because they can just do everything in generative AI tools, does that mean that we're going to have a big negative impact on the quality of generative AI models in the future, such as they completely collapse? Andre, I don't know what you think about this, but I'm relaxed about this. It seems to me like the AI systems, their ability to evaluate their own outputs. For example, I just said that my favorite generative AI tool of this time is Claude 3 Opus, and that uses reinforcement learning from AI feedback as opposed to from human feedback. And that seems to be part of how it's been able to outperform GPT-4 and Gemini. And so, I don't know, it seems to me like we're figuring these things out, and the folks at the Frontier Labs seem to have really clever ways of distilling down to the highest quality training data, one way or another, whether it's AI generated or human generated. I don't know. Model collapse, I'm relaxed about. But what do you think, Andre?
I agree. I think it's, there's a reason to be concerned because the internet is starting to get flooded with spam, AI generated spam, as we've covered many times. But to your point, I think these Frontier Labs have, the most brilliant people, basically, right? And they've been doing this for a while now and getting things like Claude 3 off the ground. So I think it's a problem that exists, and it's also a problem that is solvable. And the bigger problem, I guess, is the end of data that is being approached. And there is kind of an open question of, how much further can we push the systems? And on to the next story. New Microsoft AI model may challenge GPT-4 and Google Gemini. So Microsoft is building their own large-scale language model that apparently is codenamed My1. And this one will have 500 billion parameters approximately. So this is much bigger than what Microsoft has been releasing with Phi, kind of smaller large language models. This is more on par with things like GPT-4. And I guess it is interesting because we know Microsoft has a partnership with ChatGPT. They have been integrating OpenAI into Azure, ChatGPT rather into Azure. They brought on Mustafa Suleyman from Inflection, where they trained a large language model, and it seems like he will be heading this development. He also was, of course, at DeepMind. So it seems like a way to kind of de-risk things from the Microsoft side, where we don't have to rely on OpenAI to have their own large language model. They will have it, and of course, will be able to then compete with Google and Meta as one of the players that is able to develop these kinds of systems.
Yeah, to allow our audio-only enjoyers, so people who aren't checking, I guess, the stories as you kind of, I wonder, sometimes as I'm listening to Last Week in AI, I have my iPhone open in front of me and I'm scrolling to be, keeping an eye on the story names. And so if you're not doing that, well, then phonetically, this model is My1, but it's spelled MAI-1 for people who want to track that for later on. It's not like a
it's Microsoft AI, I'm guessing. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it is interesting to have Mustafa Suleyman there, previously Google DeepMind co-founder. and yeah, then CEO of Inflection, which seemed to be doing really cool things. And I haven't been following that story very closely as to why it seemed to suddenly just everyone who was major there has gone on to Microsoft, and this seems to be what they're working on. Maybe because of the kinds of things that you guys are often talking about on this podcast related to if you want to be at the frontier, you've got to have access to a ridiculous amount of cutting edge compute. And Inflection just might not have had that. And so they figured, you know what, let's go over to Microsoft and do it there. They've got tons of compute. And the interesting thing, you already highlighted this, so I'm I'm doing the thing that reviewer explicitly asked us not to do, but I, maybe with a little bit of a twist or a little bit of additional commentary, which is that it makes perfect sense to me that Microsoft would be trying to do this stuff on their own without requiring OpenAI, because they haven't acquired OpenAI. So they've taken a huge stake, but this isn't their IP. OpenAI can make deals with Apple, like we just talked about earlier in this episode. And so Microsoft would, you could imagine a scenario where if somehow Microsoft had created GPT 3.5 and released a ChatGPT tool, something of that quality, before OpenAI had done it, that would have been an even better outcome for them than needing to invest in an outside party and get the models from them. So you can totally understand why they would be doing this kind of thing.
On to the lightning round, and we begin with a raise of $1 billion, and that is from London-based AI startup Wayve, which makes AI systems for autonomous vehicles. This was led by SoftBank, who has thrown a lot of money around. They previously raised around $300 million, so it seems like a pretty big round, and it's interesting because we have fewer and fewer players in the self-driving space. It seems like Waymo, Cruise, Tesla are really kind of leading the pack there, but Wayve now has $1 billion, so they'll keep working on it.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add to this story other than it's interesting to me that you have two of the biggest players in autonomous driving named Waymo and Wayve, where 3 of the 5 letters are identical to the starting 3. I don't know. It's just, you'd think you'd want to differentiate a bit.
Yeah, well, it's a fun detail. And the next story, also about self-driving cars. This one on the opposite end, about a setback. So Motional has delayed commercial robotaxi plans amid restructuring. The startup Motional is a joint venture between Hyundai and Aptiv, and they are apparently pausing their commercial operations and delaying the launch of the driverless taxi service until 2026 due to restructuring. There will be layoffs. We don't know too many details right now. They have some autonomous taxi rides in Las Vegas and deliveries in Santa Monica. Those will be halted. So yeah, seems like a pretty significant setback. They did get an investment of $1 billion as well from Hyundai. So they will be continuing to be active and working on this. Perhaps this is kind of a strategic thing, hard to say. But regardless, another player in the space trying for the same thing and I guess delaying their plan to try and launch until 2026.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what's behind this another setback in autonomous vehicles, but you could imagine that was it GM that recently had the big issues where they were hiding
with Cruise?
With Cruise, yeah, exactly. And so you could imagine at the board level or something at Hyundai, them saying, these kinds of things that we're seeing happening at our competitors like GM, there's too much risk. We've got to make sure that this is really buttoned up, or let's see what happens with Waymo and a regulatory situation before, we take more risk in this kind of situation. I don't know exactly what's going on, but you can imagine something like that.
And one last story in the section, the rise of the Chinese AI unicorns doing battle with OpenAI. This is a bit more of a summary story, not anything particularly news related, but interesting to me. It kind of highlights how there are now 4 Chinese AI startup, Jipu AI, Moonshot AI, Minimax, and Point1.ai, all of which I'm sure we've mentioned in previous episodes, and all of them have surpassed $1 billion in valuation and are competing with things like OpenAI. Some of them are not necessarily working on frontier AI models. So Moonshot, for instance, focuses on digital assistants to summarize text for students and office workers. Minimax is targeting the gaming market with anime-themed characters. Point one or 01.ai, of course, has been developing AI models. So yeah, there are big players in China. We may not hear about them a lot in US media, but definitely interesting to kind of keep it in mind that this is happening in China.
The only thing I have to add here is that the thing that got the biggest chuckle from me on your episode last week was you saying, Andre, that China, the country, did not release this model. You see that so often in headlines of like, China releases.
Yeah, that's also amused me. And now on to the projects and open source section. And the first one is a paper, Prometheus 2, an open source language model specialized in evaluating other language models. This is a collaboration between 6 different institutions, so KAIST AI, MIT, various universities, LGI Research, and as per the title of the paper, this is related to evaluating language models. So they claim that they figured out a way to closely mirror human and GPT-4 judgments. Basically, you can have high correlations, and unlike Prometheus 1, which we released last year, they focused in that previous model on basically giving a score 1 out of 5. Here, this one is greatly expanded, so it can do pairwise ranking, which is what LLMs Arena does. It lets you compare 2 different answers and pick which one you like better. And as with Prometheus 1, there's a lot of kind of infrastructure that goes with this. They highlight how you kind of have user-defined evaluation criteria. That is how they had scores 1 to 5. And in this paper, they go a lot into how they expanded it to now support also pairwise rankings, how they also have an expanded data set with a lot of examples of pairwise ranking and also verbal feedback of outputs. And as per the title, once again, they release the models, code, and data all open source. So pretty promising effort, I think, to help with that evaluation challenge where you can go beyond benchmarks, use these sorts of LLMs to evaluate your own LLM, which I think is a pretty standard approach that people are doing.
I can't understate the importance of innovations like this. As someone who manages a team that develops LLMs, fine-tunes LLMs for particular use cases, and then deploys them into production, it is, you talk about on the show all the time the issues with benchmarks. Those are so flawed that it seems like you've got to be looking to something beyond that, like the Chatbot Arena that we were talking about earlier, put out by LLMs. Interestingly, a parallel, so the same faculty member at Berkeley, Professor Joey Gonzalez, who was one of the faculty members behind that Chatbot Arena, also in March of last year, in March of 2023, was one of the faculty on the release of Vicuña, the model that was a fine-tuned llama model, and it outcompeted llama. And what they did for their evaluation, they said at that time it was like only partly scientific, where they were using GPT-4 to compare side by side. Let's say, how does our Vicuña do against llama? How does it do against GPT 3.5? And so you have these head-to-head tests similar to what humans are evaluating in Chatbot Arena. You allow GPT-4 to do it for the Vicuña evaluations. And for us at our company Nebula, that is what we do most of the time, because having people, either your own customers who you might annoy if you have them kind of doing evaluations, if you bug them with that kind of thing all the time, or even if you try to internally say like, let's ask our business development team or our product team to be evaluating this model that we built and compare it against, say, GPT-4, or compare 2 different versions of our model. But it is so unscalable to ask humans to evaluate your models, because there are so many situations as a data science team on a daily basis. Even as we're checkpointing a model, as we're training it, we want to know, are we overtraining it? Are we starting to overfit potentially? Or have we reached a point where this model that we've trained is mature? And so these kinds of computational pairwise evaluations, to be able to compare two models head to head, is so important and is the future of this space if it isn't already today. And so I really appreciate folks like the researchers behind Prometheus 2 developing the specialized model for evaluating other language models. And you can bet that our company will be using this right away.
Exciting. Good to hear that you will benefit from this. Next paper, and this is now and yet another big LLM being released and pushing the frontiers of what release models can do. The paper is DeepSeek V2, a strong, economical, and efficient mixtures of experts language model. This is much bigger than the previous release from DeepSeek AI. DeepSeek was previously 67 billion parameters. This one has 236 billion parameters, but as with other mixture of experts models, the reason they say this is an economical and efficient model is that of those many, many parameters of a neural net, only 21 billion parameters are activated for each token. And so when you look at a graph they have in this paper of activated parameters versus performance, now they claim kind of a top spot in terms of, for the number of parameters, you get really good performance on the MMLU benchmark, which is kind of one of the leading ones that people still use to claim they're really good. So it's roughly on par with Llama 3 70B while using way fewer parameters. And there's various details on how they do that. They use multi-head latent attention, mixture of experts. They train on 8 billion tokens with various tweaks. And they actually released like a 30-page paper summarizing a lot of the details. So to me, a pretty exciting paper just because a lot of this is still a dark art. And this has a lot of details on how it works. And they do release model checkpoints on GitHub.
Yeah, I think I'm not 100% sure what I heard you say there, but it's 8 trillion tokens. I think I might have heard billion.
8 trillion, yes.
Yeah. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with this overtraining. So this rumored, whatever it is, I guess we might find out on Monday what that GPT-2 kind of chatbot variant is. And if that ends up being a small one that's like trained on a huge number of tokens, this is another one of those scenarios where you get so much out of a model by going far beyond what the chinchilla scaling laws would recommend. And another interesting thing here is that the chart, as you're saying, the MMLU asterisk already there in some world where MMLU is a perfect indicator of how great a model is. It is interesting to me that for DeepSeek V2, they have done exactly the same chart, which you can see in the paper. It's figure 1 in the paper that's linked to this episode. They created the exact same chart as Mistral did for the Mixtral 8x22b release. And the point that Mistral was making was, hey, look at us. Like, we occupy this top left corner of this chart where you have activated parameters on one axis and performance on MMLU on the other axis. And these two Mixtral models, 8x7b and 8x22b, occupy the top left corner. And then DeepSeek comes along and says, F you guys, we're going to occupy an even further corner in the top left. And so, it's interesting to see how people position themselves relative to each other. It does make a lot of sense. It would be nice if we lived in a world where MMLU was 100% reliable, because then this kind of release would mean that you have a no-brainer to go for if you want to have the best performance with an open source model simultaneously without the cost of running a Llama 3 7dB in production.
That's right. And one more thing I'll mention, they do have that economical detail in the title of a paper, and that's because in addition to this efficiency, they also do say that they save 40% of training costs, reduce memory usage, and increase generation time throughput by almost 6 times. So lots of tweaks to their previous approach, lots of nice improvements, and overall seems like a really strong model. On to the lightning round. First up, OpenVoice v2, evolving multilingual voice cloning with enhanced style control and cross-lingual capabilities. I think we're gonna probably want to go quick here, so not too much to add to that. This is coming from MIT and MyShell.ai and Tsinghua University, and it's a really nice model to be able to do voice cloning in multiple languages.
Nice. Maybe you'll be using that soon alongside having a Last Week in AI theme song, at least maybe in your outro. You could be spitting out Last Week in AI in Spanish, French, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean.
That is something we'll mention, actually. Translation is a big use case for these kinds of things, yeah. Next up, Granite code models, a family of open foundation models for code intelligence. This is coming from IBM. You don't mention them too much, but they do a lot of stuff in AI. And with this release, they trained these models on 116 programming languages, and they compared to a whole bunch of other open code generation models like CodeLlama. And as always, with these news stories, it's the best, and they do release it under a super open license, Apache 2.0, for both research and commercial use. So lots of progress still being made on LLMs specifically for code. And next, we got Hugging Face launches Le Robot, open source robotics code library. So Hugging Face made some news earlier this year, just a couple months ago, by hiring from Tesla. And the first fruit of that effort is now coming out with this open source Le Robot package that they say is basically meant to be sort of like their Transformers package. Transformers is a package that is used very, very widely for doing work in natural language processing with the Transformer architecture. And they want to position this as that type of package, but for robotics, where it's a toolkit that is a comprehensive platform that has support for getting data sets, for simulators, for different types of robots, for training models, for having pre-trained models, just lots of stuff. And it's as someone who has done work in robotics during my PhD, I think it's pretty exciting. We really don't have this sort of unified kind of primary package that people build on. There's kind of a mishmash of different ones. People have sort of tried to do this over the years, and Hugging Face getting into that ring and releasing this, I think, has a pretty strong chance of supercharging AI research for a lot of organizations.
Nothing makes me more excited today than this emergence or this transfer of large language models, which have over the past few years made unbelievable impacts in software, them emerging into hardware. The more that we see robotics being able to be infused with LLMs, and these kinds of open source projects make that easier and easier. In the past several months, the single piece of news that has impressed me the most is out of Covariant, so Peter Abeel's company, where they released RFM1, Robotic Foundation Model 1, and the specific idea behind that, similar to Le Robot, is to be bringing LLMs into the physical world. So autonomous vehicles being another place that you could imagine LLMs and AI being able to make a huge difference in the physical world. With robotics, there's eventually going to be an infinite amount of real world capability infused by AI. It's more expensive, as you guys say on the show time and again. Hardware is hard, so it happens a bit more slowly than software. But when you're working with actual real world physical things as opposed to just bits, there's a lot of potential there, and I'm super excited.
And the last story for the section. Last week we had no open source stuff. This week we have a lot, which is kind of cool. The story is Vibe-Eval, a new open and hard evaluation suite for measuring progress on multimodal language models coming from Reka AI. So they release 269 ultra high quality image text prompts and their ground truth responses designed to be difficult. So on the 50% of a hard set, all frontier models fail to arrive at a perfect answer, leaving a lot of headroom for progress. And they say that this is meant to complement MMLU. MMLU is a multiple choice question, and here they have like a golden answer that is the ideal answer, and they have an evaluator Rega core that gives you a rating from 5. So kind of similar to Prometheus in a way, but for specifically multimodal AI rather than just chatbots. And yeah, exciting. Again, lots of work being done on evaluation because it's just something that's just needed. And now on to research and advancements. And we start, of course, I think, with the big news of the past week, and that is AlphaFold3. As is so often the case, the major research news in the media, and I think kind of fairly also just among the AI community, is coming from DeepMind. And this one is AlphaFold3, the next generation of their AlphaFold models. So in the past, they focused on protein synthesis and analysis. Now they expanded to other capabilities within kind of the biomolecular interaction analysis. So this is going way beyond my knowledge base, but just reading out of the abstract, it is a model that is capable of structure prediction on complexes, including proteins, nucleic acids, small molecules, ions, and modified residues. They say that it significantly improves accuracy over many previous specialized tools. So far greater accuracy on protein ligand interactions and protein nucleic acid interactions. Again, I don't really know what that means, but probably pretty cool. And the sort of exciting bit from an AI researcher perspective is they do this by kind of simplifying their approach. So in the paper, it passed in AlphaFold 2, it was a pretty complicated architecture with some very kind of custom built parts for the task. It wasn't the sort of general purpose model as we see with foundation models. Typically, it's just kind of a transformer with nothing specifically built for the task. And that's why they're able to scale and do lots of things. So in the paper, they go into how they essentially have simplified the architecture, trained it on many tasks, and despite removing these things that are, meant to make the model do better at the specific task, they're still able to train it up to be about as good. One more detail, they do say they will not be open sourcing this, unlike they did with AlphaFold. This is done in collaboration with the kind of more commercial arm of Alphabet, Isomorphic Labs, that is in partnership with DeepMind. So it will be interesting to see if they try to commercialize it, whatever. But yeah, exciting news once again from DeepMind doing research on AI for science.
Yeah, Google DeepMind, up until the ChatGPT hubbaloo. That's not really a word, but I think people know the word I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Until that happened, I think it's safe to say that Google DeepMind was unequivocally the world's leading AI lab, and their approach to AI was different. So folks like Ilya Sutskever at OpenAI said, I think scaling up is in and of itself going to have all these emergent capabilities. Let's just take this transformer architecture and 10x the amount of data that we're using, the number of artificial neurons in the architecture. Let's 100x it. Let's 1000x it. And that leads from GPT-2 to GPT-3 to GPT-4, more and more emergent capabilities. And so they're kind of taking that engineering focused approach of let's take this attention mechanism and scale it up really, really large, see what happens. Google DeepMind might have been surprised by how effective that scaling approach was, that engineering approach, because what they were doing with things like AlphaGo through to AlphaZero, they were systematically trying to make their way towards artificial general intelligence, so an algorithm that has all of the learning capabilities of a human, by starting narrow, like a single game like Go, and then saying, okay, let's see what we can do to have an algorithm that can not only beat the world's best Go players, but also the world's best chess players and the world's best shogu players. And then a year later, let's add in Atari video games alongside that. And so their approach was to, chip away generally adding more and more capabilities until eventually you reach this AGI algorithm that can do anything. And so that seems to be the same kind of approach that they're doing here, where with AlphaFold 2, the press headline at that time was that they solved protein folding, at least for some types of proteins. And so similarly here, DeepMind has taken that same kind of approach that we saw from them going from a single game to multiple games to games and completely different kinds of modalities, adding in board games and video games. Here, they started with proteins, absolutely crushed that, and then said, okay, well, let's see what we can do with other kinds of sequential molecules. So proteins are made up of strings of amino acids. And here they've said, well, let's see what we can do with strings of nucleotides, which form DNA or RNA. And then that gives you so much more training data, a lot more diversity of data. And just as we saw with the shift from, say, AlphaGo to AlphaZero, adding in more games, instead of having the kind of catastrophic forgetting that plagued early attempts at generalization, we're seeing more and more that cutting-edge labs like DeepMind in particular are able to take these different kinds of data, these different modalities, and be able to have a single algorithm that outperforms. So AlphaZero, which could play more games than just Go, was better at Go than the specialized AlphaGo model. And similarly here with AlphaFold3, we're seeing the same kind of thing where AlphaFold3 is outperforming AlphaFold2, which was already the state of the art, at protein folding by taking into account other kinds of information, by being able to model other kinds of data like DNA and RNA. And then in this case, unlike, there's no obvious, at least immediately, like maybe as you get closer to AGI, then is some kind of way that you can think about how being good at chess would make you better at playing Pong on Atari or something. But interestingly here, with this innovation, there is built in these interactions because in a biological system, DNA is interacting with RNA, which is interacting with protein. And so built in right there, you have, this generalization providing quite a bit more utility. And it's really exciting to see.
And now on to the next paper, very different, but also very exciting. It is xLSTM, Extended Long Short-Term Memory. This is coming from a variety of people, organizations in Austria, and with the last author being Sepp Hochreiter, who is the developer of LSTM. So short history for people who may not know LSTMs but know transformers. LSTMs are a form of recurrent neural nets, and they were sort of the main thing being used in natural language basically until transformers for a couple of years. And they achieved a lot of cool things, but architecturally they were sort of abandoned because they are kind of tricky to train and tricky to scale up compared to transformers. They have some of these inherent limitations architecturally. And so this paper, xLSTM, is presenting a variation and extension of LSTMs that aims to fix that in a sense. It introduces some pretty fancy new modules. So just to get into a little detail, they have memory cells with xLSTMs that have memory mixing and exponential gating. They also have mLSTMs that add the ability to do more parallel training. A lot of kind of nitty-gritty details with this extension that would take probably half an hour to get through. So unfortunately, we won't be getting into a lot of the details. But the end result of these architectural improvements is that, at least in the experiments on this paper, they show pretty comparable characteristics to transformers in training. So when training at 2.7 billion parameters on a bunch of tokens, they show kind of the golden outcome, which is you can have a scaling law that shows that as you go from not super many parameters to a ton of parameters, you have a smooth decrease in perplexity on next token prediction. And in fact, when I compare the characteristics of xLSTM to things like Mamba and Llama and other architectures of neural nets that do language modeling, in this paper, they have the best performance at every sort of scale of model. Very much related to what we've been seeing with Mamba as far as exploring alternatives to transformers that incorporate some of the ideas from recurrent neural nets to transformers, attention, all of that, and potentially a big deal. I mean, the results are pretty impressive, and this is coming from one of the pioneers of natural language processing neural nets. So generate a lot of discussion, and will be very interesting to see if people continue to build on it.
Yeah, for sure. So two German researchers, at least one of them, Hochreiter, was involved in this paper, but Hochreiter and Schmidhuber first published on LSTMs in 1996, which is wild to think about where we were at that time in terms of neural network scale. So that's the same era as LeNet 5, which was the first ever commercial application of a neural network. And so that was Jan LeCun, Joshua Bengio, and others at AT&T Bell Labs at that time who created this LeNet 5 architecture that was commercialized for the US Postal Service in order to be able to recognize handwritten digits for zip codes, so postal codes in the US, and so be able to add some automation to routing of mail. And that was kind of the peak of neural networks for a long time. We then went into an AI winter where to get funding for neural network research, you pretty much had to be in Canada. No other federal government was supporting that kind of research until the AlexNet moment out of, again, Ilya Sutskever, Jeff Hinton, working on that AlexNet paper, and Alex Krzyzewski, of course, the third author on that paper and the namesake of AlexNet, that in 2012 brought kind of deep learning into this, into acceptance that not only is it super powerful once you scale up compute-wise, but it's also highly generalizable. And so anyway, so a little bit of a history lesson there to say that this kind of architecture, the LSTM, dates back to before that last AI winter, that last deep learning winter. And so this kind of approach, generally from Hochreiter and Schmidhuber, has been around for decades. And it's interesting that they have been able to, with this paper, make changes, because if you tried to use an LSTM alone before we had transformer architectures in that Vaswani et al. Paper, Attention is All You Need, before that, LSTMs were kind of the best way, the best known way of trying to link many words together in a sentence or in a paragraph and be able to make linkages between those to be able to have some kind of attention. The transformer completely blew the LSTM out of the water, such that I'm not aware of commercial applications of it today. But Hochreiter, Schmidhuber, other researchers have continued to push along on this LSTM idea. And it's interesting to see that we're now getting to a point, at least according to this paper, and again, as you already stated earlier in this episode, as usual, it is the best on the benchmarks that they selected. And so it's hard to know exactly where it stands. But yeah, I mean, even if it's performing comparably to transformers or to Mamba, these other kinds of state space models that are coming out now, it is exciting because it would be great, and it wouldn't be surprising if in the coming months, in the coming years, we're able to get architectures beyond the transformer that allow us to have that same level of attention capabilities that the transformer has without the really heavy compute.
That's right. And there are the results are really impressive. There are some limitations worth noting, and they do note them in the paper. So some of the components of this architecture, the xLSTM, is not parallelizable computationally due to some of the details of how it's implemented. They say they do have an efficient CUDA implementation with optimizations, but still, when you're deploying these things at scale, when you're trying to optimize the cost of compute, something like this may not necessarily be the best. But at the same time, contrary to transformers, this kind of architecture has constant memory complexity as opposed to quadratic increase in usage with respect to the size of the input. And that is similar to things like Mamba that just have these better scaling characteristics in terms of how much compute you need as you try to input, a crazy amount of text. So will remain to be seen whether this is like the new Mamba and everyone starts working on this and go crazy, but definitely exciting in terms of still seeing potential successors to transformers, at least in some context.
Yeah, we're really trying to have our cake and eat it too, aren't we, Andre, with this kind of research where you're like this extended LSTM, xLSTM, you're like, hey, on a relatively small scale, we're able to get way better performance than a transformer on memory. But the transformer, one of the beautiful things about it is that it does scale so well. So that architecture was designed specifically to be parallelizable across many GPUs from the beginning. And so, yeah, trying to have our cake and eat it too, not use much memory, be highly parallelizable, get the same kind of attention that we can get with transformers. But, there's so many labs trying to do this kind of thing, and it is so important in order to make AI be something that is broadly accessible and not super expensive and not requiring more and more and more nuclear power plants to be set up to run AI centers. So yeah, really cool to see.
And just one last thing I'll mention is they do say in the paper that conceptually xLSTM is somewhat closely related to things like retention, RWKV, and HGRN2. Various groups have been exploring the idea of making RNNs work at scale. And this is an ongoing topic of research, so we shouldn't make it seem like this is like the one and only attempt at this. It's been going on for a couple of years, and there's been some promising results already. But this is exciting in part because it's coming from that pedigree of the original inventors of LSTMs. On to the lightning round, and the first paper is Story Diffusion, Consistent Self-Attention for Long-Range Image and Video Generation. They present a semantic motion predictor that in particular helps with consistent video generation. And they also have examples of kind of multiple image generations. They kind of present an idea of a comic book where you have a single character that is consistent across the frames of the comic book. And this is one of the challenges with image generation is, if you say generate X, you will have a different outcome every time. And there's been many papers on how to make consistent outputs for creating comic books, creating illustrations, whatever. And so this is presenting a new way to do that and has really nice looking smooth videos and these comic book panels. So again, you can go and check out the link for those example outputs. I wish I had the time to actually edit videos to add all these example images of what's happening here, but pretty cool bit of research here. Next up, Chain of Thought empowers transformers to solve inherently serial problems. This is more of a theory paper that honestly would take me a while to understand, but the gist is that they show that kind of theoretically the idea of chain of thought, which is, as we mentioned many times, prompting your language model to list out its reasoning steps before providing an answer to a given query. They show that this general approach for a certain category of problems that inherently require serial computation, so multiple steps of thinking, enables transformers to solve those types of tasks that if it were not doing chain of thought, if it were doing just an immediate output of whatever answer you want, it just would not be able to get it right. Versus for these types of problems, it could get it right. So for people who enjoy reading dense theory papers, I'm sure this is an exciting one.
An analogy that I sometimes make, and I don't know, there's probably theoreticians out there who would say there's all kinds of mistakes I'm making in what I'm about to say, but I think of chain of thought prompting as a improvement on the kind of fast thinking that humans do. So there's a famous book by the economist Daniel Kahneman, who actually recently passed away. And so his most famous book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. And this is based on decades of experiments that him and Amos Tversky did. And so these two thinking systems, there's system one, which is fast thinking, which is what we're using all the time. I'm using it right now. Words are just coming out of my mouth, and I'm kind of just hoping that the next word that comes out is useful to some listeners out there. Whereas the slow thinking, system two, this is where you're sitting with pencil and paper and you're making sure that you've got all of your assumptions right as you work through a mathematical problem or you're writing some computer code. And in order to make this analogy very easy to understand, as you say, learn how to drive a car, you start off with that slow system two thinking where you're like, okay, foot on the brake, turning the key in the ignition, and now I'm going into reverse and pressing the accelerator. You're having to do all this very deliberate thinking. Whereas once you have learned how to drive a car, you're listening to the Last Week in AI podcast as you're driving, and you're having a conversation with a friend and drinking out of your coffee all at the same time. And so it moves from this, your own brain becomes adept at shifting things from the slow processing to the fast processing. Chain of thought prompting like this, to me, is like making the most of that fast thinking. You're prompting the generative AI model, which is just predicting next token, like you are when you're speaking in real time or thinking in your mind, in language in real time. And so chain of thought prompting is like making the most of the fast kind of thinking that humans do. What I'm excited about in combination with this kind of chain of thought prompting and generative AI is approaches like alpha geometry, as well as Q-star, which are specifically designed to be much more like the deliberative thought that you have when you're doing math, when you're learning how to drive a car, when you're computer programming. And so that kind of slow thinking in combination with fast thinking, including chain of thought fast thinking, could be a really interesting combination towards realizing AGI.
And just one more paper, also a bit more of a theory paper with a bit more of an applicable front, and one of that generated a lot of discussion. It is KAN, Kolmogorov-Arnold Networks. And again, we'll go a bit quick because it is sort of dense. The gist of it is they present a whole new paradigm to how you build your neural nets. So typically, the idea of neural nets is to have at the most basic level, multi-layer perceptrons, where you have some weights on edges between neural network units, where the units do some function on a combination of its inputs. And this paper presents a whole new alternative that basically puts that paradigm on its head, where you have functions on the edges and the nodes just sum up the outputs of those inputs. And they go into a whole lot of detail of kind of conceptually why this has some advantages in terms of interpretability and the potential expressivity of this sort of whole new paradigm for how you build your neural nets. Again, a bit more theoretical in the sense that probably people will not adopt this at scale, I suspect, but interesting if you like these sorts of very conceptual papers. And onto the policy and safety section, with the first story being US lawmakers unveil bill to make it easier to restrict exports of AI models. We've been talking a lot about export controls for GPUs and hardware to China in particular. that has been in the US. And now a bipartisan group of lawmakers unveiled a bill that would actually make it easier for the Biden administration to impose export controls on AI models, make it hard for software to be shared, essentially. And if approved, the measure would remove some roadblocks to regulating the export of open source AI, that apparently there's already some precedent for that ability by the White House. And there's some more details in the story. Interestingly, apparently many in China have been building on top of Llama in particular as the starting point to making their language models. So evidently that would be why the US lawmakers are seeking to do this. So yeah, very interesting conceptually to think about actually having export controls for open source models.
It seems like one of those stories that Jeremy would be really great at going into further analysis on. He really knows what's going on Capitol Hill. The one thing that I would say here is that it's too bad that we live in a world where geopolitical conflict is real. I mean, I'm not pretending that it doesn't exist, but it's a shame because it seems like we're so close to having so many of these emerging technologies like AI, nuclear fusion, quantum computing, being so close to realizing them and having them being able to bring abundance to everyone on the planet. But these kinds of things, which I totally get, it makes perfect sense in the real world that we live in with geopolitical conflict. But it's just a shame that we can't have everyone getting along and everyone collaborating on open source, on hardware, instead of having to have these kind of competing groups and one region having to feel like they are needing to catch up. And it's interesting because it seems like mostly like a futile exercise anyway. So, the US restricts access to some hardware or to llama architectures to, say, China. And China then invests a whole bunch of redundant capital in recapitulating the same kinds of advances separately, and eventually seems like they'll catch up. So it's like, I don't know, it seems like a lot of wasted potential, a lot of wasted capital, and slowing down the capacity for everyone all across the planet to be living a higher quality of life. But yeah, I mean, I'll take my rose-tinted goggles off.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, there's been a lot of framing of this AI race between China and the US in particular over the years. And it is not entirely a fair kind of way to pose things. There's a lot of academic collaboration between these labs. There's a ton of research coming out of China that people in the US read and build upon, and vice versa. So this kind of notion that these are enemies isn't the full picture, even as there's very much a real situation where the US law is seeking to basically combat the ability of China to make advancements. And I think with this kind of law, would be surprising if it can actually be effective to actually block the ability of open source models to be used in China. But it does speak to making big moves, basically continuing to add to pressure, as we've seen also with hardware export controls. Next up, OpenAI's model spec outlines some basic rules for AI. So OpenAI has released the first draft of this proposed framework that they call model spec to propose basically how AI tools should respond. It's a bit like, you could say, like an ethical framework almost, where it proposes 3 general principles. AI models should assist the developer and user. They should benefit humanity, and in the case of OpenAI, they should reflect well on OpenAI. There's also specific rules here, such as following chain of command, complying with laws, respecting creators' rights, protecting privacy, and not generating not safe for work content. And it has been positioned, at least online, that I've seen, as trying to make it very clear what principles are guiding OpenAI's development. So it was maybe a bit opaque, and what I've seen positioned is, if ChatGPT doesn't want to reply to you, with this model spec, they can say, okay, this was a mistake and the model should have behaved differently, or this was what we want to do according to our model spec. And it's very interesting to see, given the impact of OpenAI and just how influential they are now, seeing this released and having more clarity on their internal development processes.
And probably, to some extent, at least things like reflecting well on OpenAI, following along from the drama of last year. Not surprising to kind of see this thing in there. Does this remind you in any way, Andre, at least like in some kind of vague analogy, is it reminiscent to you of Anthropic's Constitution?
Very much so. I think Constitution is making very clear on what you want your model to do. In a sense, this is maybe a broader in scope almost. It is kind of half technical, half PR almost. And I think it probably is at least partially motivated by the big PR disasters at Google in recent months, where the model started doing, really largely criticized behavior of generating different races in historical context. So this model spec is kind of clarifying exactly how they want their models to behave and why they might refuse to do certain things but do other things. Onto the lightning round. First story, robot dogs armed with AI targeting rifles undergo U.S. Marine Special Ops evaluation. So the robot dogs are literally the sort of things you may have seen already from Boston Dynamics, and these ones developed by Ghost Robotics specifically. And they are equipped, literally there's a gun mounted on top of it from defense tech company Onyx Industries. And this is kind of small scale testing at this point. There's 2 of these things that they are experimenting with. This organization did clarify that weaponizing the dogs are just one of the many use cases being evaluated, and that it apparently adheres to all Department of Defense policies concerning autonomous weapons, presumably meaning that you do want to have a human in the loop and not have this be fully autonomous. But regardless, I think pretty notable in that we still don't have fully autonomous systems. We have some examples of drones being semi-autonomous, but we are still not in an age where robots are being deployed in battlefields and doing a lot of the work of kind of a traditional soldier. And if these sorts of systems of dogs with guns, undergo evaluation, development, within several years, it is not kind of out of question that they will be a large factor in battlefields in warfare. And that is something that maybe we are forgetting in this ChatGPT moment. There's a lot of concerns about disinformation, misinformation, but it's just a matter of time until we have kind of scary robot soldiers.
Yeah, I think 2023 was the year where there were supposedly some cases in the Ukraine-Russia conflict of drones working behind enemy lines where, so if you create, there's this, there's warfare and this counter warfare to create drones. Obviously, that's the first step. So you have drones and you're sending them over enemy lines. You're monitoring them. You're having loitering munitions that attack them. And so your opponent then says, okay, well, let's create all kinds of jamming to prevent the remote control operator from operating this drone effectively. But then that same drone operator says, okay, well, if I lose the ability to control my drone in enemy territory, what should we do? And 2023 was supposedly the first year where in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and it was the first place anywhere in the world that we're aware of, drones started to be able to act on their own after losing connection to their controller. So, the jamming is effective. It prevents you from being able to see what your drone is doing, but you still, the drone has some expense. It has some munitions on it. It's behind enemy lines. And so it's using maybe open source. It would be using, it's so interesting, like all these kinds of tools that we're developing to try to create a better world for the most part. Python code, machine vision libraries, PyTorch would be being used to have machine vision systems work behind enemy lines once you've lost control of that drone. And it's, hopefully that like open source based machine vision system is accurately detecting the enemy as opposed to just, someone tending to their turnips or something. And yeah, it's obviously a minefield. And it seems inevitable that we're going to see more of this, which is, a scary thing. And it's not inconceivable that some years from now, most of the fighting could be being done by autonomous vehicles as opposed to by humans making decisions. And obviously lots of concerning things there.
Yes, and as we've covered in the past, there have been efforts in the UN to have some sort of policies with regards to autonomous weapons that go nowhere. They have been blocked by countries like the US. Now, definitely these are still in early development phases, so not likely to be out there within the next year or two, but still, we haven't seen too much news on this front, and this is an example that this is actually happening. And another story on OpenAI, they are releasing a deepfake detector to disinformation researchers. So this is a tool being released to a small group of disinformation researchers meant to detect DALL-E-free outputs to distinguish between real images and synthetic images generated by their tool. And OpenAI says that this will have 98.8 accuracy, although it will not be able to detect images produced by other generators like Midjourney and Stability. So good news to be able to see what images are from OpenAI or not, but this whole area is still kind of unsolved, it seems to be.
Yeah, it's a relief to hear that. And I guess it's unsurprising. You have a lot of experience in machine vision, Andre, so you might be able to speak to this as to how you end up kind of having signatures in the generated images or generated video that allow it to be identified as from a particular generator. And I'm grateful that we're able to do that with images, video, maybe audio, because it's proved to be, since the release of GPT-4, extremely difficult to identify generated text. But people have been, for all of history, able to generate fake text. And so we're kind of prepared to take with a grain of salt things that people say or things that people write. But images or video, up until the last year or so, we have been able to, to have the saying, seeing is believing. Whereas in the last year, that statement is basically no longer true. And so it's great that we are able to detect. And it's interesting that it's kind of fundamentally different because of these kinds of signatures that we can detect in it. I don't know if you have more kind of technical knowledge on that, Andre.
Yeah, there's been research coming out for a while now on the ability to embed invisible watermarks, basically some things that humans would not be able to perceive even in the pixel space of the image, but that could be used to verify whether this is coming from a specific model or not. And I'm sure that this tool relies on that. And we've been covering, there's been more and more announcements of things like Meta saying that will add watermarks to their generations, partially based on some pressure from the executive branch of the US government and some of the policies instituted there. So definitely some progress being made, but it's still very hard when you release a model that's open source like Stable Diffusion. That is, for bad actors, easy to mess with and make it so you can't detect images. So it's not really a solvable problem fully, but at least for things like DALL-E free, you can do these sorts of techniques. On to the last section, synthetic media and art. And the first story is Audible's test of AI-voiced audiobooks tops 40,000 titles. So last year, Amazon has announced that self-published authors in the US who make their books available in the Kindle store would be able to use a new tool in beta to release audiobooks on Audible with AI-generated narration. And as per this news article, that has now resulted in 40,000 titles being released on Audible. And that, as you would expect, has led to mixed responses, with some Audible users being unhappy that there is this onslaught of audiobooks, while independent and self-published authors who basically would not be able to afford to hire a voice actor to do a professional narration benefiting from this and being happy that they can use the tool. The article is pretty detailed. It goes into some conversations with actual voice actors, and it doesn't seem like jobs are being impacted quite yet. But of course, you can see the concern that maybe it would impact that industry soon enough. I wonder, John, I know you wrote the book Deep Learning Illustrated, and I don't know if it makes sense to do an audiobook. Probably you do have illustrations in that book, but I could also imagine, as you write things, perhaps a new book, whether you would consider doing this sort of thing, or with your podcasting experience, just do your own narration.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have thought about an audio format for a book like Deep Learning Illustrated, and my guess is that it doesn't really work, because not only does Deep Learning Illustrated have lots of illustrations, which, yeah, okay, you could maybe even kind of narrate the images and try to make them make sense. You're definitely stretching the kind of visual emphasis of the kind of pedagogical approach that I took there. But even worse than the images is that I tried to minimize equations. And so, there's not there still are quite a few equations. Like there's got to be 100 or more equations in the book. Those would be very difficult to kind of visualize if you were just listening to somebody reading out equations. But even worse than the equations is that the book is full of Python code.
So that would make more sense.
Yeah, I mean, that would be some really, really dry listening where you're like, okay, import data frame. It's like, yeah, it would be pretty difficult to listen to. And at least with the way that I did it, it's the code is really interdigitated right in there, integrated right in there with the text and with the code and with the visualizations. And so it's hard to imagine a book like that working well in an audio only format. But related to this idea in general is that one of my best friends, his name is Zach Weinberg, and he was a guest on Super Data Science in episode number 646. I've brought him on that episode to kind of be like a layperson giving their experience of how ChatGPT has impacted them professionally. And he said to me, you're so lucky in a way to have written a book before the generative AI era, because now anytime anyone writes a book, there's going to be some skepticism as to how much you actually did yourself. And that'll happen more and more and more and more. And so I guess, yeah, I'm lucky to have squeaked one in there right at the end of the of the human writing era.
Next story, TikTok will automatically label AI-generated content created on platforms like DALL-E 3. So I guess related to that detection story, although in this case, they will be using a technology called content credentials that is being developed by the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which was co-founded by Microsoft and Adobe. So in this case, these images will have some metadata. You don't need to do analysis of the image to guess whether it is AI generated or not. Rather, these platforms will just include information to say that they were generated on the given platform. And now TikTok will be building on top of a standard to make it clear whether images are AI generated or not. And speaking of that, a couple maybe slightly more fun stories related to AI generated images. The first one is that Katy Perry's fan-made AI image is so real it fooled the world into thinking she was at the Met Gala. So yet another example, we've covered some of these before, of things going big where they were in fact AI generated, but people, at least many people, thought they were real. And in this case, it was these images of Katy Perry being dressed in some very fancy dress at the Met Gala. There were some fun outcomes of this particular one where apparently Katy Perry's mom even texted her and said, "Wow, you were at the Met Gala. This is a gorgeous dress." And Katy Perry then responded saying, "That's AI generated, beware." And so, yeah, and this article goes into some details on how a fan of Katy Perry who runs a fan Instagram developed this and how it took actually some work. They used a Microsoft tool, they used a second tool to then post-process it, things like that. But yeah, now basically don't believe what you see is the lesson that we're getting.
Yeah, seeing is not believing. I got to say, obviously, we can't in this audio-only podcast be showing you these dresses, but it does look spectacular and it does look pretty compelling. It would be very difficult. I don't think I would be skeptical if I saw those. And
yeah,
I guess
you would have to do some very close analysis to notice some of those details, as is the case in general. Maybe if you look at the background carefully, you could detect some hints of AI.
Right. Yeah, they're actually, at least in one of the ones that we can see here, there's like a whole slew of photographers that are like appropriately dressed, and they all seem to have 5 fingers on their hands.
As far as we can tell, yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of deepfakes, the next story is South Korean woman falls for deepfake Elon Musk and loses 50,000 in romance scam. So it goes into some details on how this person was contacted on Instagram by someone posing as Elon Musk. And of course, this person didn't immediately believe that story, but there were a lot of interactions where first this supposed Musk told some stories, and eventually even they had a video call with a deepfake of Musk convincing this person to then give up some money in the scam. And we've covered some stories like this in the past. I keep saying this, but this is something you need to be aware of. Scamming is going to be a big thing with AI, and be careful, people.
Yeah, it's something that not only you as an individual need to be aware of, but I, for one, have several times, and I hope that this message has really gotten to them. I've told all of my loved ones that if you ever get a phone call from me asking for money or any, like, call me back, or make sure it really is my number, because, you and me are in the same boat, Andre, where there's a lot of, we have many orders of magnitude more samples of audio available publicly on the internet than needed to simulate our voices effectively, and it'd be very easy to scam our voices. And yeah, definitely scary things could happen.
Yeah, all of us gotta watch out now. And related to this particular story, one last one that John was aware of. I didn't actually see this. The story is why young Russian women appear so eager to marry Chinese men. And it's a similar kind of story where there are deepfakes of these Russian women who apparently can speak Chinese fluently, and then similarly essentially develop a romance scam to get Chinese men interested.
Well, I think that this is even more so than a romance scam. I think it's supposedly it's a government thing. So this is an effort to like it's not so much about individually targeting an individual and getting money from them, but it's using real Russian-looking people. So, for example, there's a real woman here, Olga Loyik. I'm probably mispronouncing her surname. She's a Ukrainian woman studying in America, and her likeness was used in generative AI tools where she's speaking perfect Mandarin with the Kremlin in the background, comically. And there are dozens, she found dozens of accounts using her face where in these videos, she's glorifying China and for complaining that Russian men are drunk and lazy while praising Chinese society and technology. These women with names like Natasha and Sophia in their fluent Mandarin are saying things that, like, for a Chinese husband, we'd be delighted to cook and wash your clothes and bear your children. And so it seems like it's a propaganda thing more so than a targeted scam. But nevertheless, I don't know. There's something about the story that I don't know. It's like the confluence of so many different things. It's like geopolitical issues, romance, generative AI. Anyway, it makes maybe kind of a fun story to end today with.
I think so. Yeah. And with that, we are done. And thank you, John, for co-hosting while Jeremy takes a well-deserved break.
Yeah, my great pleasure, Andre. As I said at the outset, as a rabid listener of this podcast, it's surreal to be able to come on and always have a lot of fun. And I look forward to listening to more episodes in the future.
And as always, we are very appreciative of our listeners and fans. So thank you for listening. As always, I got a plug. We do have a newsletter, Last Week in .ai. And as always, if you are a big fan, it would help if you give us a review, share it with your friends, that sort of thing. But more than anything, we do hope you enjoy the podcast and keep listening.